Something that a lot of businesses get wrong with research is once you get to that elusive product market fit, it's really tempting to dial down on that research. And that's dangerous because you lose sight of your customer. That means you can lose sight of growing dissatisfaction, or you can become complacent. Product market fit is not static, it changes and it can disappear.
Hello and welcome to the Emerge Product Market Fit Academy series, where we're joined by leading operators and founders in edtech to share practical insights and advice for early stage founders. If you're building the future of learning and work, then this is for you. I'm Zara, and I'm joined by our guest today, Kirsten Campbell-Howes. As an avid language learner, I'm particularly excited about this episode, as Kirsten is the former Chief Learning Officer at Busuu, one of the top language learning startups worldwide. With a strong B2C and B2B product range, Busuu has helped over 120 million learners around the world and served clients such as Inditex, Adidas, and Unilever. Busuu sold to Chegg in 2022 for $436 million in one of Europe's biggest ever edtech exits. Among other things at Busuu, Kirsten collaborated with a cross-disciplinary team to design, iterate, and test new product features and courses based on user feedback. She built and scaled the education and localization teams to over 50 members, initiated and managed Busuu's academic research partnerships, and led learning design with corporate partners, including overseeing Busuu's partnership with Uber. In over 2 decades in edtech, Kirsten has devoted her career to helping education companies incorporate new digital technologies and achieve successful outcomes both for learners and for the business. So I'm excited to dig into this conversation today. Thanks for joining us, Kirsten. To start us off, would love to hear more about your time at Busuu. Tell us what it was like when you first joined and how it evolved over the almost 8 years that you were there.
Thanks, Sarah. It's great to be here. Yes, so when I joined Busuu, it had already been around for a few years, but it was quite small, 20 people. Very startup-y, little office in Old Street, great startup vibes. And my role was to build up the education team and our education offering, build out our methodology, and kind of add that kind of pedagogy and sort of academic rigor to the product. And I built a team of learning designers, helped to build up our localization team because Busuu is used in many countries around the world. So it was really important that we localized it for specific markets. Along the way, we acquired an online tutoring marketplace called Verbling, and I was part of that acquisition and then integrating tutoring into our B2B offering. Worked very closely with our product teams on bringing machine learning and personalization into the product. And then went through the acquisition by Chegg, which completed in 2022 last year, which I'm sure you'll know is a sort of very rigorous and demanding process going through an exit, but we were very happy with the outcome. And then I spent a year helping to integrate into the Chegg machine, because Chegg is a very big publicly listed US business. And then I was ready to pass on the reins to a deputy in my team at Busuu, and I left a couple of months ago.
Super interesting to hear that journey. Let's now move into the heart of our conversation. So today we have a lineup of 2 key topics to discuss: customer research and solution development. Now, these topics are crucial for the early stages of building a successful startup. First, we'll dive into customer research. Understanding your target customers and their needs is essential for building a successful product, but it can be challenging. So we'll explore how to design a research program that delivers maximum results for minimum effort, as well as strategies for gathering feedback from markets that may be difficult to access. Secondly, we'll shift our focus to solution development. Once you've gathered insights from your customers, it's crucial to transform that knowledge into a well-defined product roadmap. We'll explore how to collate, prioritize, and act on early customer feedback, and we'll discuss the frameworks that can help you build a strong product roadmap. Kirsten, we're excited to hear your insights and experience. Let's jump right into our first topic, customer research. In the early stages of a startup, conducting effective customer research can be difficult, especially without a dedicated research team or prior expertise. As someone who's navigated this process at Busuu, what strategies would you recommend to design effective research programs with limited resources?
Yeah, this is a really important and crucial question for just about every startup. We didn't have much research expertise at the beginning, and we recognized that and went out and got some training. So at the time, UCL, the university in London, was offering training for edtech startups, and I believe they still do actually. It was a sort of short 5-week program, and a few of us went once a week in the evening, and we learned very simple strategies for building good research quality and what I would call research hygiene. But you can get this information online and in various books. So research hygiene is about designing research that works and which doesn't bias the results you get, really importantly. As an example, it's just a basic human instinct to sort of give people the answer that you think they want to hear, right? If I said to you, do you like my product? You're probably going to go, yeah, it's great, because you don't want to upset me. And if you're leading customer facing research, it's important to know this and to devise research hygiene strategies to prevent that outcome. For example, you can say at the outset of an interview, we really, really welcome constructive feedback, however critical. You're not going to offend me if you say something critical about this product. I didn't design it. Really open to any feedback that you want to give. Another classic example of that is if you ask someone whether they want feature X, Y, and Z, they will always say yes, because people want more features. And that's not necessarily going to help you decide whether you should build feature X, Y, and Z. It's better to ask, what feature would you like to see, and see what emerges naturally from the customer's own desire, rather than your thoughts about what your feature list should be.
That's a great tip. Otherwise, you end up with a long list of different features that you actually fed to your research participants in the first place. Both quantitative and qualitative data are important, but founders tend to focus on one over the other, usually the one they feel most comfortable with. How important is it to have both, and how do you strike a balance between the two when it comes to research data?
This is where some of the research training we had was really useful, because one of the concepts that came from that is what they call triangulation of data. And the idea is that you don't lean too heavily into either quantitative or qualitative, but you use them to reinforce the hypotheses that you're developing. It's usually harder to collect large amounts of qualitative research. But if you're only collecting quantitative research, you can be missing out on some very core insights into why people are doing things that they're doing. An example, at Busuu, we used amplitude to collect a lot of quantitative data. So we could see, for example, that 50% of people were not completing a certain lesson. But that didn't tell us why they weren't completing that lesson. And it was only by doing qualitative research, by interviewing customers, that we were able to understand, there's a particular exercise type that's very tricky, and the user interface is challenging for users here. And that's why so many people are not completing this particular lesson. So without the qualitative insight, the quantitative data didn't help us, or might have led us to make incorrect hypotheses, like we need to scrap this lesson and not use it.
That's very helpful on why you need both to complement each other and really get a better understanding of what your quantitative data is telling you once you have the qualitative. Are there any creative approaches to gathering this kind of data that you've come across?
Yes, it can be really challenging sometimes to access customers, especially when you're starting up. You might not have access to tools like Amplitude. You might be targeting a group of people who are difficult to interview. Children, for example, really hard to do research with kids. In that case, you need to get quite creative. And it is okay to use friends and family members. For example, if you can't access your target customers directly, try and find an adjacent group. And something that we did a lot at Busuu, which was incredibly useful, was just using the team. Now, you shouldn't only use your team, but actually your team has a lot of expertise, a lot of understanding, and an in-depth understanding of your product. But what often happens in startups and in more mature companies is that people stop going through the product, and they especially stop going through the first user experience of the product. And once they do, almost invariably, they go, oh my goodness, I hadn't seen that. Or how did we miss that? So a lot of times it's really useful to just get your team to sit down, sign up as a new user, go through that process again, or do a diary study, spend a week using the product as a new customer and taking notes on the experience. However many times we did that at Busuu, we always gleaned really valuable insights from it. But many companies forget to do this.
Putting yourself in the shoes of a new user and actually documenting your experience to just remind yourself of what it's like through that journey from day one of using the product. Now, when you're doing research like that, there's no hard and fast metric or milestone to know how much you need before you actually start building. How do you know when you've done enough research and generated enough customer feedback to start building your MVP? And then once you have built an MVP, do you continue to do research? Is this a continuous activity of collecting data that you do throughout the product lifecycle?
Yeah, I speak to a lot of founders who have done almost no research because it's just so challenging, or they're so caught up in fundraising and what have you. And you must be doing research, even if it is just internal research or with a family group, ideally with people as close to your target customers as possible. But at the other end of the spectrum, you shouldn't be gathering tons and tons of data and then getting paralyzed with indecision. So that there's sort of two differing ends of the spectrum, and you want to land probably somewhere in the middle where you are doing enough research to build good hypotheses about what people like, what they don't like, and what you should be building next for them, but not just gathering loads of data and then either not doing anything with it or coming up with 1,000 hypotheses, 1,000 feature ideas, and not being able to move forward as a result.
There's definitely a good balance between not doing any research, but also doing far too much research and using research as procrastination for actually getting your product out there. So we've covered the importance of customer research and gathering feedback, but another aspect to consider is actually reaching target customers in markets that may be difficult to access. What has your experience been with this, and what strategies have you found effective in obtaining feedback from these kind of markets?
Yeah, it's very challenging. And Busuu had customers in, I forget how many countries, but it was, I think, over 150 countries around the world. So we couldn't interview people in all of those countries. We had to pick which markets we were particularly focused on. And there's a number of strategies you can have. Ideally, you have someone in your team actually who represents that market. We found that very helpful. As a language learning business, we were lucky perhaps in being able to pull in people from all over the world, often representatives of markets we were interested in, and they gave us a lot of insights. Having access to someone who sits in that market, who can test for you there and give you feedback, whether they're an intern, whether they're an employee, whether they're a contractor, always worth finding people in market. Another tool that we used at Busuu that was really helpful in giving us access to specific markets was Intercom. It's a very powerful tool that's used for a lot of things, but we used it for research. And it enabled us to segment our database of customers into groups. We teach 15 languages to people all across the world. Let's say we are particularly interested in customers in Turkey who are interested in learning English. That's a big, important user group for Busuu. Intercom would enable me to go through our database, search for users based in Turkey who have identified that they want to learn English. I can then send out an email or a survey to those specific users. So I'm not bothering people learning German in Turkey, for example. I can translate and localize that message in that survey so it's going to them in Turkish. That's really important, localizing your research for specific markets and not assuming that everybody speaks English. And we were able to get thousands and thousands of survey responses using this tool, which was incredibly helpful for us. Now, there are other tools out there that you can use if you don't have access to Intercom. SurveyMonkey is incredibly useful. There are many research tools out there that you can use. Some of them are much more powerful and useful than you might assume, actually.
Now, with the capacities of like Airtable and Zapier, I'm sure for the very hacky and hustly teams, you can pull something together yourself as well that allows you to segment those user groups and act accordingly, whether it's sending out personalized emails and testing out features and things like that. So now you've emphasized the importance of understanding the user problem, gathering and analyzing customer insights. Let's dive into the next stage, solution development. So it's really important to effectively collate, prioritize, and act on this early customer feedback to drive product improvements. Could you walk us through how you leveraged early customer feedback at Busuu to shape the development of the product?
We've talked about decision paralysis from having too much research data. We did gather a lot of research data early on and continuously, and we could have got stuck either just ignoring that data or not knowing what to do with it. And one thing we did quite early on in my team is I hired a research lead who had expertise in building research projects, surveys, and so on in an academic setting. And her sole job became collating this data and translating it into actionable insights. And the way we did this at the beginning was through something called the Customer Feedback Bank, which was basically a Google Sheet. It was a very big Google Sheet, but it gathered in information from wherever we could get it. So that might be App Store reviews, it might be feedback directly to the customer service team, it might be survey data, it might be user interview data. And her job was to take that raw data and translate it into a set of categories. So, for example, a really common bit of feedback that we would get was, I'd like more speaking practice. And this would come in multiple languages. It would be said in different ways. But her job was to look through the data and go, okay, here's another person who wants a form of speaking practice. So she would then codify that line of data with a number or a letter that related to wants more speaking practice. And we would do the same thing for other common requests. Needs help planning a curriculum, wants more reading practice, and so on. And in that way, every month or so, the product team, the learning design team, we would look through the customer feedback bank and we would analyze what's the most common feature request or content request at the moment. Lots and lots of people are still asking us for more speaking practice. Let's drill into that a bit more. What do they mean? What could we build that would meet that customer need? Are lots of people asking us for reading tools? No, not at the moment. Okay, so we won't be so concerned about that right now. And that was how we took a mountain of what could potentially have been very confusing data and turned it into something meaningful for us.
So it's a case of collecting all that data from different sources, building up a list of these common requests and ranking them according to frequency so you can prioritize the problems that people are actually facing rather than just features that the team was excited about and wanted to build internally. And once you've collected this customer feedback, the next step is to translate those into a product roadmap, all those requests that you've gotten from customers and users. And building a product roadmap requires making strategic decisions on which features to prioritize and allocate resources to effectively. Could you share your approach to building a product roadmap and the features or frameworks that you found useful in prioritizing features and building out an actionable plan?
Yes, so we used a framework called RICE standing for Reach, Impact, Confidence, and Effort. And we would then take the data that we got from the customer feedback bank, which was kind of a list of feature requests in a way, and we would feed that into the RICE framework. A common request was, I'm struggling to know how often I should study, how to structure my language learning study. And we had a theory that, okay, if we build tools that help people to build a schedule, calendarization features, that will help meet that request. Okay, great. Now, what's the reach of that? How many of our customers are actually going to encounter those tools in the first time user experience or in their first week? If we build it this way, it'll be 95% of them. Great, that's a big, strong reach. What do we think the impact of that is going to be? We're getting 45 inbound requests for this every week. That's an indication that a lot of people are struggling with this and need that tool. It's likely to have, therefore, a high impact. How confident are we in that impact? We've never released anything quite like this before, so our confidence is fairly low, actually. What's the effort involved? And this is the biggie. And this is where you need your engineering and product teams to get really involved in this product roadmap planning and to say, okay, if we build a feature like the one you're requesting, that's going to take our engineering team 3 months, 3 weeks, half a year, whatever it might be. And therefore the effort score is this. And then you do this for every feature request and it stack ranks them again. And it's often very surprising. Sometimes it becomes really obvious, oh, these things we need to do. They're low effort, high impact, or high confidence. Let's go with those. And then the more interesting challenges are the ones where you have really high reach and confidence, but the effort is also incredibly high. And therefore, you've got a really big trade-off to make, because do you want to tie up your engineering team for 6 months? Maybe you don't. But RISE is a really useful framework for provoking these conversations with your product leadership and engineering leadership teams. And sometimes it doesn't even need to be leadership. Sometimes people in the team can just make these decisions without much input from leadership, actually. But RISE is a great tool for having those conversations and for making sensible, non-biased decisions about the product roadmap rather than just doing the thing that everyone really wants to do.
And once you've used RISE to really prioritize where you want to focus your efforts, how do you translate that ranked feature list of, okay, these 3 things are the priority right now, into a product roadmap that's mapped against a tangible timeline that people can follow and the teams can get involved in, like mapping their actual day-to-day tasks against?
We used a version of this in the learning design team, actually. And when we started using this, we used story points. A story point is a slightly arbitrary way of attaching a kind of unit of time to a piece of work. So, for example, you could have one story point for something that a learning designer can do in an hour, right? You almost don't need to timetable it. It's just a quick thing, just do it. 3 story points might be something that takes a day. 8 story points might be something that's going to take a month, right? So it's not perfectly linear and it's not perfectly mapped. It's a guide to whether something is a small, no biggie problem or a really challenging, time-consuming thing. And by considering the use of our time, whether it would be in learning, design, product, or engineering in this way, we were able to say, okay, this is something that we can complete. We think it's always theoretical until it actually happens and real life occurs. But we think, to the best of our knowledge, this is how long this is going to take. And as your team matures and does this more often and builds it into their kind of DNA, they just start to know how long certain things are going to take. For example, we would create content in 2-week cycles. And at the beginning of every 2 weeks, just like a product and engineering team, we would look at what we were thinking about building. Oh, we need to build a course for Uber, a bespoke course for Uber. How many story points do we think is this something that we're going to be able to get done in one sprint? No, this is bigger than that. This is going to tie up 3 learning designers for 3 months, whatever it is. And you don't necessarily have to do it every 2 weeks. But for us, for a long time, we did find that discipline of using story points was incredibly helpful.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing the RICE framework: reach, impact, confidence, and effort. Super helpful. Now I'd love to dive into a bonus topic, the topic of chief learning officers. So what is a CLO? What do you do? And when do you bring on a CLO as a startup in edtech?
Okay, so confusingly, there are 2 types of CLO. There's a chief learning officer who sits in a big corporate organization and looks after the learning and development of the employees in that business. And then there's a different kind of chief learning officer, the kind that I was at Busuu, who is much more concerned with learning outcomes and learning science and is the guardian of the learning experience of the customer. So when I started at Busuu, I was the head of education. We were a smaller company then, had a smaller C-suite, probably didn't need someone with the clout of a chief learning officer. And also importantly at that time, I didn't have what I now have, which is a master's in applied linguistics from Oxford University. So I actually studied that during my time at Busuu. So I became more qualified and more experienced in the learning sciences during my journey. As head of education, I was Essentially doing the same job, but I was much more focused on scaling up content production, building the learning design team, developing the learning methodology. When I became the chief learning officer, I got involved in more externally facing work where I was sharing the learning methodology at academic conferences. I was taking part in academic research projects with third parties. I was working more strategically on how do we embed machine learning into our courses? Where should we be going in the future with our learning? What's our overall learning methodology and strategy for things like assessment, for example? So it became more outward facing, a little bit more theoretical.
And as an edtech company, when do you bring on that type of CLO that focuses on the learning science side of things?
Interestingly, I talk to a lot of edtech startup founders, and I'm finding that a lot of them who have very content or learning focused businesses are bringing on content and learning specialists far too late in the journey. There's a tendency in ed tech startups for people to focus on the tech first, or to get excited about the tech and forget that for the customer, what they're there to do is learn. And the majority of the time they spend in your product, they are learning something. And if you don't bring on content, learning design, learning science expertise early and make that a core part of your leadership team and your strategy, you're going to struggle later on. And you may find that you struggle with things like retention. You may start to get negative customer feedback because you can have the most exciting, brilliant technology. But if people aren't feeling the learning outcomes, if they're not feeling that strong sense of progress, they're not going to stick with you. And you may also struggle to raise investment rounds in the future because as you grow in stature as an edtech business, investors will start caring much more about learning outcomes. They will want you to be able to demonstrate them, and they will want to see that rigor and seriousness in your leadership team. So you don't necessarily need to have a chief learning officer at the beginning, but if you're an ed tech business and you have a CTO and a CPO, you should be asking yourself whether you also need a CLO. Because if learning is what your customers are looking for, you need someone representing them in your leadership team.
Absolutely. Let's go back a little bit in the stage before you've got a CTO, CPO perhaps. What do you do when you're at the very early stages, but you want to bake in the learning from day one, from early on? How do you do that without a full-time CLO hire?
The great thing about edtech startups today, and this was not true 8 years ago when I started at Busuu, is there are now lots of really qualified learning designers, really experienced learning designers out there in the market. When I started, learning designer wasn't really a thing. I had to take teachers and train them myself to become instructional designers, learning designers. That is not the case now. There are tons of people who've worked at different edtech startups, designing learning, building learning. Many of those people have master's or PhD level qualifications as well. So they're out there, these people. And you don't have to hire a permanent employee, but you can certainly hire a contractor. You can hire someone part-time. There's a lot of good people out there on the market. You're not necessarily going to find the right person straight away, but you're certainly going to have an easier time of it today than you would have done 8 years ago.
That's great advice. Now there are so many more people with that background. Just getting someone involved in that journey, even if it's not full time, can give you the perspective to make sure you have the education and learning side really built into the bones of your product. Another thing that I was really interested in is how you integrated AI into the Busuu product and what kind of opportunities and challenges you see with implementing AI into these kind of learning products and experiences.
I know AI is a massively hot topic right now in 2023, but it's been a hot topic in language learning for much longer than that. And Busuu has had a wonderful, we call them the Brain Squad, a really wonderful team of machine learning specialists, data scientists for many years now, who've been using machine learning, which I heard described the other day as applied statistics. And that's the way I like to think about AI. It's applied statistics which, if used well, can personalize learning to the individual. And in fact, Busuu's Brain Squad has recently published a couple of really interesting blog posts on how we've done this in our placement test. I'd encourage you to go out and look for those if you want to understand the detail. But essentially, for each learner on Busuu, when they complete some kind of exercise, it's connected to learning a phrase, learning an item of grammar. We start to build up this understanding of what they know, what they don't know, and how well they know things. So we can build up personalized review sessions or tests that test them on the things that they struggle with. If you know how to say hola, there's no point in us testing you on it. But if you struggle with como estás, we need to test you on that. So for each thing that you do on Busuu, we develop a score that then develops a prediction of how well you'll perform on that item next time you encounter it. And that enables us to create really personalized learning sessions for learners. And that helps them to build up the long-term memory that is so crucial to retaining vocabulary and grammar and then being able to produce it in conversation. So I'd say Busuu has been incorporating AI really successfully for a long time. The team will tell you that there's lots more that they want to do in the future, but AI is super exciting for language learning, and applied well, it can really create excellent results for learners.
Thanks for sharing that. I love hearing about the Busuu Brain Squad, and definitely the capacity for AI to shape personalized learning experiences is one of the most exciting opportunities to really meet learners where they're at and make sure no learners are left behind. So I really love that. How do you translate AI into a sustainable competitive advantage in a startup when it comes to edtech?
It's a major challenge because done well, applied well in a product, the machine learning part is almost invisible. And as a learner, you might be being served a completely personalized experience, but you don't necessarily know that. You don't know that it's very different to another learner's and that it's working much more effectively for you. Unless we spell it out to you all the time, and learners don't really like being given long explanations about the product. They want to get on with the learning. It can be difficult for people to even know that there's some lovely applied statistics working in the background. So it's hard to sell AI sometimes. And some people would say actually that it's table stakes, certainly in language learning now. Busuu is not the only language learning business that's using machine learning successfully in its product. And there's an expectation, I think, that it is used. So how you translate that into a competitive advantage, I don't think I have the answer to that question. I can tell you it's really important, and I'm sure everybody in edtech is thinking and talking about AI almost all the time now. It's become an expected thing, so you need to have it, but how you translate it into bottom line, that's an interesting conversation, and it's probably one that we could chew over for a lot longer.
It's a really interesting lens, though. It's table stakes, but if you do it well, the learner doesn't even notice that you're doing it. It's just an elevated experience, but because you don't see what other learners are seeing, it's really hard to know how tailored your experience really is. Super interesting. So, one final question before we move into the quick fire round. Would love to hear about, in the frame of the customer research and solution development, over your time at Busuu, what would you do again and what would you do differently?
So I think we did really well with user research, making it a focus early on, hiring someone specific to manage that process and make sure it worked and to turn it into actionable insights. Something that I think that a lot of businesses maybe get wrong with research is once you get to that elusive product market fit, a found product market fit, it's really tempting to dial down on that research, especially the qualitative research. And that's dangerous because you lose sight of your customer. And the way the world evolves so rapidly right now, that means you can lose sight of growing dissatisfaction, or you can become complacent. I've found product market fit is not static. It changes and it can disappear. It could grow, but it can also disappear. And I think in my team, in the learning design team in Busuu, we found that if we didn't do customer research for a period of time, that was always a bad idea. And we needed to get back to it because we discover things had changed. An example would be that we didn't have a lot of video in our product at the beginning, but over time, video just became an expected thing for app users. And we needed to scramble to get that content in there because once we were doing user research again, we realized, this is what's missing. So I would caution all edtech startups to get your research program in gear, get someone who focuses on it, but don't stop. Even if you do find product market fit, don't stop doing your research.
Super clear. Don't get complacent once you've found product market fit. There needs to be continuous research and continuous customer feedback to maintain that competitive advantage that you've built and keep your customers close to you. Fantastic. Let's move into the final part of our session, our quick fire round. So I'm going to ask you a quick question and you respond with a one-line response. Are you ready? What feature were you most excited about shipping at Busuu and why?
Oh, that would definitely be our conversation exercise, where you learn vocabulary and grammar when you're learning a language, but on Busuu you get to use it in a real conversation. So we would give people prompts. You might have learned how to talk about your family. Well, now describe your family, record your voice or write a paragraph, and we would send that out into the community, pair you with someone who speaks the language you're learning, and they would get into a conversation with you about that. And that was really transformative for learners because they found themselves having real conversations almost from day one. And that enabled them to actually develop confidence in speaking the language.
What's the number one thing people most often get wrong about product in edtech?
That the tech is more important than the ed. That's the number one mistake I see.
What book would you recommend to founders building amazing edtech products right now?
Controversial, I have yet to read a good book about product in edtech. Almost all the ones I've read that I've been recommended I thought were terrible. I think there are some brilliant newsletter writers out there. There's some brilliant podcasts. I love listening to the Pivot podcast, Cara Swisher and Scott Galloway. I learned so much about products, not just in edtech, but outside edtech. And I think you need to have that broad understanding of what's going on in product generally. And that will inform you whether you're a learning designer, a chief learning officer, an engineer, a product manager. Having that broad understanding of what's going on in the world, that will inform what you're building.
What skill do you believe will be most crucial for future edtech entrepreneurs?
I think edtech entrepreneurs need to understand business. I meet a lot of founders who come from a very technical background or a learning background, and they're missing the business and especially the business finance. And I think you don't have to have an MBA, you don't have to have an accountancy qualification, but you need to understand some basics about investing, business finance, or you're not going to be a successful entrepreneur.
And last one, if you had unlimited resources, what audacious edtech idea would you pursue?
I think the university model is broken, and I think the academic research model is completely broken. So many people pursuing research that nobody reads, that just ends up going nowhere, that the public doesn't have access to. I know there are some people who are trying to solve this problem, but not enough. Making research relevant to the real world and accessible to everybody, that's a problem I think I would definitely try and solve if I had $1 billion.
I love that, tying it back to research. Kirsten, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your approach to customer research and solution development and your story with Busuu and all your learnings. It has been incredibly insightful.
Thank you, Zara. Real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Emerge Product Market Fit Academy. If you enjoyed this episode, please like it, follow our channel, and if you're feeling generous, share it with a friend.